Tēnā rā tātou katoa. He mihi ki te mana whenua o tēnei rohe, ngai tua huriri. Nei rā te mihi ki a koutou i tēnei rā. Ko he kurangi te maunga, ko wai apu taua ko Ngāti Porou te iwi, ko Becky Kiddle tōku ngoa. E noho ana i pōneke, enai nei. So I am Becky. I currently am at Wānanga, Aotearoa. I direct a new research centre there called Te Manawa Haukura. I'll try and go through this relatively quickly, but I've been given a task to talk a little bit about decolonising cities. And I've never been at a conference where the trees around the stage make more sense. So it's great to be in the forest, so to speak. So I don't actually know much about urban forests, which is probably not something I should admit at the start of a talk. But I can intuit the value of them for a decolonising agenda. And so I have really sort of focused the talk on that. It's a bit strange not being able to see the slides, but I have an urban design background, and so the way I look at the world is through how we might reshape our cities. Particularly my agenda is in a decolonial way. And if anyone knows Rhys Jones's work, he very clearly makes the link between decolonisation and decarbonisation. And I know, again, that there's all of these kind of links being made between urban forests, carbon emissions and so on, or reducing carbon emissions and things. But there's a clear link across both decarbonisation, the establishment of urban forests, in my opinion, and decolonisation. So I just wanted to sort of pose the problem, and I know you all know about colonisation, but I just want to pose that colonisation problem in the context of an urban setting. So this image you will see often online, and it's often titled Māori land loss. But if we kind of switch that around, the narrative could be it's actually the overlay of another set of worldviews or values on that piece of whenua or that land. So it's the encroachment of a notion of private property ownership, and most of you will know that Māori didn't see whenua as a sort of capital asset that was to be bought and sold. It was sort of shared collectively. Of course, there were skirmishes over land and who could sort of inhabit bits of it, but it wasn't bought and sold in the way we see it's done today. And that kind of capitalist neoliberal system that underpins our cities, I think, has a lot to answer for in relation to establishing urban forests. And you can see that this encroachment of another set of values happened pretty quickly. So the first, and you can't see it super well, but the first North Island is 1860 and the last North Island is 1940, essentially. So over a period of 80 years, Māori lost most of the land in the North Island. And you get a really aggressive place-making project happening as well. The left is obviously Christchurch, where we are now, but the right I always put in because it's such a sort of stamp of colonial impression on the whenua. This is Martinborough, of course, with the Union Jack laying out the village square. We have seen the disregard consistently of sites of significance across the country. In Tāmaki Makaurau, Auckland, 70% of the volcanic maunga or mountains in that region have been lost due to development and so on. And of course, maunga for Māori are identifiers, they're signals of identity. And of course, there's a really strong heritage agenda, but it pretty much only focuses on colonial agenda because it's only focused pretty much on what is built. So much of the stuff that was built in a Te Ao Māori sense has gone. So any historic focus on buildings equates to a colonial heritage agenda. As opposed to a Māori heritage agenda, which would be much more about trees, much more about whenua, much more about environmental infrastructure that is important to identity creation. And of course we have this new grand narrative that Simon so eloquently talked about this morning, climate change and so on. So I think there's a social and cultural justice imperative to re-establishing forests or bush in the urban centre. When I was doing a bit of work on this, I wondered why we don't call it bush. I mean, I know there's a sort of scale difference, but in Aotearoa, that bush seems to be a very kind of a more local word. I know it's sort of Dutch origins, but anyway. So I just want to talk about 4 points really quickly. The first one, and they're all about how do we reclaim or decolonise our cities, and clearly establishing urban trees, urban forests, bush, whatever we want to call it, is a critical part of this. And the first one is really about reasserting mātauranga Māori. Now you hear that a lot, people talk about that a lot, particularly in research circles. So probably most of us kind of hear that and go, oh, we're not quite sure what that means. That feels so nebulous, can't hold on to anything with that. But I think this is a really interesting kind of definition of the way in which Māori ways of thinking is different from that Western style of thinking. And so I'm just going to have to read it because I can't remember it. So there's a sort of the Māori epistemological penchant for trying to understand the connections and relationships between all things human and non-human first. What is whakapapa? Provides a contrast to the Western paradigm that tries to seek knowledge and understanding by a close and deep examination of something or someone in isolation first. What is it? What does it she do? Whatever. And what is it for? So why I put that up is because relatively recently the Western world seems to have hit on this idea of systems thinking being really important. But this is kind of sort of critically fundamental to the way that the Māori world thinks about the world. It's very much about the system and about things interconnecting with one another. Unfortunately, colonisation happened, and for me, the travesty of that is we've had this knowledge set severed somewhere along the way. So many people, including me, have lost our access to much mātauranga Māori, and we're scrambling to kind of get it back. And so the current government's complete sort of disregard for, it seems, almost anything Māori feels pretty hurtful in that respect, because it's kind of like, gosh, we're struggling to get it back in the first place, and now this sort of compounding kind of issue of a government that doesn't continue to support that. So many of us have sort of been left without that access to knowledge. However, there are some really hopeful examples, mostly in that kind of research space, of people reclaiming and drawing on traditional mātauranga to think about today's problems, And this is from my field, urban design. One of the things I got taught in the UK about urban design, good old Kevin Lynch, if anyone's heard of them. He has a very sort of clear thing about the structure of cities and landmarks being an important part of a city. And of course, in the Western world, a landmark is often a church or a clock tower. And so we've continued to do that in Aotearoa, New Zealand, of course, because we're an outpost, so to speak. But here is a fascinating example of where we've got our own DNA. So for Māori, maunga are our landmarks, and yet we make no attempt, although Auckland, I think, is doing a really good job at the moment in trying to reclaim those view lines and view shafts towards their maunga, but we make very little attempt to acknowledge that these are our landmarks, these are our wayfinding tools. I think we don't do a huge hugely good job at thinking about the nuances of green space, urban forests and bush and so on, and the way they relate to Māori notions of tapu and noa. So if we think about these green spaces as a continuum of tapu, from tapu to noa, and a continuum from sort of human-centric spaces to wildlife-centric spaces, then the city becomes a kind of more nuanced and interesting place, right? So, and we also kind of can take away some of our arrogance that it should all be for us, when in fact we could be thinking more carefully about which parts of our city are not for us, in fact, which parts of our city should we be excluding ourselves from so that our wildlife can flourish. And the second point is back to that kind of systems idea, so moving away from kind of our myopic ways in which we come up with solutions to problems. And I'll quickly read this. So to take a well-known example, traffic congestion has been tackled through increasing road capacity, which in turn has encouraged automobile dependency. This has reduced opportunities for natural exercise, which facilitate in part an increasing incidence of obesity that has led to growing problems of public health, exacerbated by increased exhaust pollution, which contributed to increased emissions, which played a role in climate change, which led to flooding in some places, desertification in others, which reduced the agricultural yields, which supported the increasing use of chemical fertilisers leaked into water systems and created oceanic dead zones and so on. So the point being that often we're coming at these things in very myopic ways without that kind of sort of holistic, whole-of-world thinking. And I know people talk a lot about the way in which Māori think about the connectivity of things, and there's a sort of often a kind of airbrushing out of that as projects move on. There's a we understand that this is a connected system, you know, humans and non-humans all matter, and then as things move along, actually humans win out, right? And I think this is really an important way of thinking about our cities, and these are the bits of cities that change at different rates of time. So this is a temporal model of a city. So the bits at the bottom are the slowest to change. The environmental infrastructure, the soil, the waterways, they all change at very, very slow rates. So if you screw them up, you're screwing up the rest of the system, essentially. And what I find in the spaces that I'm in, which is with a lot of architects often, is that people are very focused on those shorter parts of the system, the buildings, the details, the lovely Māori art, which I'm not saying is not a good thing because they're beautiful, but that's where the focus of the kind of decolonisation project is, on putting in a whole lot of urban art, as opposed to the more fundamental changes needed. Okay. So we need to privilege those longer lasting bits of the system, which includes urban forests. And this is me mucking around with I think they're called the black maps, are they, of Christchurch. You know, what if we had sort of really kind of acknowledged the existing kind of environmental infrastructure when we slammed our grid on top of Christchurch. Of course, green spaces linked to water. The mana of why is incredibly important to all this. So urban forests need water. There's a clear relationship. How do those things kind of go hand in hand when we're thinking about urban forests? And then finally, how do we mesh the green and the human networks? And I won't talk too much about this because I know there's some good people like Miriam talking about the social stuff later on. But to me, decolonisation equates to mana motuhake, which is about sovereignty, agency, which equates to choice. And that equates to kaitiakitanga. So again, to use this same diagram, this diagram doesn't exclude humans, right? So it's not, the sort of mantra in the Western world about conservation has been very much about protecting and carving off and hiving away things, away from humans, to protect them. And Te Ao Māori, kaitiakitanga is not about shifting something away so that they're separate. It's actually about how do we sustainably use and interact and coexist with those green things and those non-human things. And here, so I'll just quickly go through this. And then we did a project, a few of us, looking at some of this stuff. And this is actually, we ran a public competition focused around Porirua, asking people to design a decolonised city. And surprise, surprise, many people focused in on green stuff, you know, revitalised urban green spaces, urban forests, renewed wetlands, and so on and so on. So this video, and I won't play it, but is the winners of the rangatahi section from Te Kura Māori or Ngā Mokopuna in Seatoon, where they tell us very eloquently the kaupapa behind their design, which is all about reclaiming te taia, or the environment. And if you wanted to know more, we wrote a book called Imagining Decolonisation, which is not about urban trees, but I would suggest it's very good background reading if you're thinking about the ways in which urban forests might be a decolonial act. And then there's a couple of other books particularly focused in on sort of built and natural environment stuff if you're at all interested. Kia ora.